So Tara, thank you so much for joining me for this short interview. Over time, you got into coaching and into neurofeedback and now into imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome, which for me is a super fascinating topic and something I can definitely relate to in my career to have suffered with at various points in time. So tell me a little bit your journey, how you went from engineer to super expert and author, even with your book Unmasking, in the topic of imposter syndrome, and kind of why is that important and what really is it?
Right. Okay. Well, let me start with my starting point, which actually wasn't engineering. So I wanted to be a psychologist, but my family wasn't keen on me doing that, and so they encouraged me to do engineering. So I had a 10-year career in engineering. Before then, I finally got to back to what I was passionate about, which is helping people. So then I did my diploma in holistic therapy and started working, helping people with all sorts of, stressful situations. And then a few people kept coming back to me, which was not the point, right? The point was for them to be empowered and go off and have a great life. And so the engineer in me was asking, okay, why? What's going on? Let's see if I can solve this problem. And the answer turned out to be the belief that we hold, which is the mind's model of the world, and a specific belief in particular, which is the belief that our worth is conditional. So I went through some fabulous work focusing on changing that belief. And then I trained in that area. And as I was working with that, one of my clients actually talked about imposter syndrome, and I thought, oh, I haven't heard of that. So when I investigated, started looking into it, that was my big light bulb moment, because when I saw what imposter syndrome was, knowing what I knew about conditional worth, it was so blindingly obvious that the root cause of imposter syndrome was this belief that our worth depends on what we do. I do something good, I am good. I do something bad, I am bad. So that was a huge revelation. So then I dug into all the literature survey, the academic research. I did some interviews to confirm that initial impression, and it was absolutely spot on, which is wonderful. And so I started working with imposter syndrome and solving the problem of imposter syndrome. And as I'm a continual learner, I'm always experimenting and trying things. And I tried out some neurofeedback, where you are sitting in a dark chamber with electrodes on your head, measuring your alpha brain waves, as one of the things we were doing was going through a belief change process. And it was phenomenal and amazing. So although I'd been focused on personal growth and development for, by this time, nearly 30 years, it was still a revelation. So it's still fantastic. So I trained in that, and in order to help people, I learned the neuroscience behind it. So I started studying this whole area of neuroscience, and the neuroscience showed me why the original coaching that I did in imposter syndrome and conditional worth, why that worked, why the why the neurofeedback worked, and it allowed me to put together a very structured process that would allow people to let go of the belief that drives imposter syndrome in a very repeatable way. So the engineer part of me liked that as well. So that's how I got to where I am, which is specializing in imposter syndrome and specializing in getting rid of the root cause of imposter syndrome.
I like that very much. And I think, they come across a little bit imposter syndrome in musicians and actors in the past. Sometimes you would hear that with challenges there. But why have you come across this in leaders specifically? I know you coach a lot of executive leaders, and why is it important to understand more in the business context?
Yes, very good question. So first, I think I need to define what imposter syndrome is. So imposter syndrome is the secret feeling of being a fraud when you're not, right? Feeling that you're not quite good enough despite being very successful. So we're talking about leaders here, and you're absolutely right. Um, it can affect musicians, it can affect athletes, it can affect actors, anyone who is very successful, yeah, a high achiever. One of the things that comes up for you, or the manifestation of that belief of conditional worth, shows up as imposter syndrome. And so the reason I focus on leaders is for a number of reasons. One, um, there is an old school belief that, leadership is a talent, that you're born with it or you're not, right? And I dispute that. And I think it's very much a skill. But one of the things that hampers people who are at that top high performing leadership level is imposter syndrome, is this internal self-doubt, and is all the things that I'm going to talk about in a moment, about the symptoms and how they show up. And because the world used to think that leadership was a talent, there was no support for it. You get promoted to managing director, CEO, and the board doesn't say, so what training would you like? What development program? No, they assume you already have it because you're good. And because you're good and you're capable and you're competent, nobody's questioning, nobody's offering you like remedial development, but there's this internal imposter syndrome that's going on that is stopping you from being the leader that you want to be achieving all that you want. So firstly is to help leaders who don't get a lot of support or recognition of that support. And the second is the impact. So when somebody changes the belief that drives imposter syndrome, it changes how they relate to other people. It just changes their decision making, their thought processes for a positive, right? So it's very helpful. So when I work with a leader, there's this ripple effect, and it impacts everybody who's working for that leader. And when you eliminate imposter syndrome, you're more productive, you're happier, you're a more energized and a more engaged leader. And I think that's really good for our whole society if our leaders are like that.
So with everything that you've said, what is imposter syndrome? What are the kind of side effects of it? What are some of the underlying factors that drive it? Give me a little bit more around imposter syndrome itself and how it affects people.
Sure, yeah. So imposter syndrome, as I said, it's that secret feeling of being a fraud when you're not. And it affects 70% of high achievers. 7 out of 10 high achievers at some point in their career experience imposter syndrome, and that is men and women equally. And it's not a medical syndrome, even though it's called a syndrome. It's because it's not something that needs psychological help, right? It's not a flaw, it's not personality, it's not a weakness. In fact, psychologists would say, because they take people from dysfunction to normal functioning, and imposter syndrome is what's getting in the way from between normal functioning and peak functioning. So that's the journey of getting rid of imposter syndrome. And it has a massive effect on a career, and particularly a high performer's career. So there are 3 main areas that the symptoms show up. One is the mind, the thinking part. So those are things like having that self-doubt, asking that question, am I good enough? Asking yourself, why would they hire me? Asking yourself, when are they going to fire me, right? And these are for people who are having fantastic reviews, and nobody would have any idea that they're having this internal doubt. The next part is the body, the physiology, because imposter syndrome, when it gets triggered, it creates this stress. It creates this fight or flight or freeze response. So the nervous system triggered, and the problem with that is when the nervous system gets triggered, your blood flow gets redirected to your muscles so that you can respond, and it actually it gets taken away, reduced to the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain, which is your logical, strategic thinking and planning part of the brain. So there's a 2012 Princeton University study that showed that when you have that change in blood flow to the brain, your IQ temporarily drops by 13 points. And that's a huge drop, right? And the things that go with it. So of course, people's mind would go blank. Right? They can't remember things. They make less good decisions. They're more impulsive. They're more reactive. They're a little more hostile. They're less sensitive and aware of other people's emotions and thoughts and feelings around them. So it has a significant impact in the body. And of course, then on performance. And then the final way that it impacts, and I'll just show you a list of these behaviors now. So these are the typical imposter syndrome behaviors. This is how it shows up, and it's different for everybody. It's different amounts or degrees for different people. First and foremost, people keep it a secret, and they don't share it with other people because they think it's them, and they feel shame or embarrassment or anger at themselves for it. So one of the behaviors is procrastinating, putting things off, deflecting praise. They say, oh, it's just good luck, good timing. Oh, my team's marvelous, but not really taking it in and not feeling it. They might be hiding their opinions for fear of either looking stupid or that some will find out that they don't know everything. And so another is avoiding, which is avoiding promotions or avoiding roles because you don't want to risk that going forward and people finding out that you're not good enough. So those on the left side in black there, those are behaviors about hiding the imposter syndrome and hiding yourself. And those behaviors will hold people back. So for example, if you avoid going for a promotion, say you just delay it by 2 years, right? Doesn't seem that great in a 35-year, 40-year career. But if you delay that, then there's actually a financial implication, right? And I did a study recently just totting up what that might be for somebody who reaches a CEO level, for example, but they've delayed their promotions by 2 years for the whole of their career, then the kind of differences you see that they make CEO at 53 rather than 41, which they have the capacity for just by those 2-year delays in every role. And it can cost them like a third of their total whole career earnings. And of course, at the CEO level, that's easily over £1 million. So, it's a significant thing when you avoid roles and it holds you back, and you've got the frustration that you know that you're good at, you know you can do this, and yet you can't seem to bring yourself to take the next step or as quickly. And on the right-hand side, we've then got the behaviors where we don't feel good enough, so we try and make ourselves good enough. So we become perfectionistic, which takes an awful lot of time to make everything perfect, especially when it doesn't need it. We're comparing ourselves, comparing how we're feeling on the inside, this little niggle of self-doubt, with how everybody else, all our peers are looking, which is capable and competent and confident, even though they'd say the same thing about us. So that's where the comparing is. Over preparing, reworking things over and over. It can take someone an hour to write and craft an email when it doesn't need that level of attention. Not having enough, that's a sense that you never quite have enough qualifications. So you're always looking for, if I just get this one, maybe I'll be okay, maybe I'll feel better about myself, but the qualification isn't the problem. And finally, pushing through is trying to ignore all of this stress, all the anxiety that's causing, and if I just push my way through, then I can leave it all behind. It's a way of trying to cope with it, but that doesn't work very well either. So those are all the symptoms, the action symptoms of imposter syndrome. So what it creates is confusion, right? Because logically, you're capable and competent. Internally, you're just not feeling it. And it's not low self-esteem, because you wouldn't be at that level if you had low self-esteem or low confidence. It's not that. It creates a sense of isolation. It's massively distracting, so you don't perform as well because you're always got this second track playing in your mind. It's distracting, you're not as focused, and it creates anxiety and overwhelm, and it can lead to burnout and people ending their careers. And the real problem of imposter syndrome is all of this behavior, all of this stress is completely unnecessary suffering. Right? Imposter syndrome has a solution, and yet because people think this is me, right, then they don't even know that there's a solution. And so they feel trapped, they feel stuck. Sometimes they think, maybe I wasn't cut out for this role. And this is why sometimes people leave their jobs as well, even though, and the great shame is, they can do it and they would have been great at that particular job.
Absolutely. And building on that last thought a little bit is, people often get moved around an organization. They join for one job, but
Yes.
within 6 months or a year, because of a reorganization, they found themselves in a slightly different role and a different job. And even more doubt comes in on that feeling of fraud. And I personally can relate to everything on those behaviors and just the way of thinking that you had on those slides many times in the past. That self-doubt and feeling of slightly being a fraud in a situation has come many times. What for you have been some of your greatest moments of success, and what are you doing to kind of drive the topic of imposter syndrome and the awareness around that and the results that you can generate from that in businesses and with other executives?
Yes, great question. So for greatest success, I would say every single client.
Nice.
It's a transformational program, and people feel freedom. They're enjoying their work. They have effortless confidence. They're calm and energized. They've got resilience. They've got authenticity, and they're leading in a way that they want to. Um, and that for me is just amazing. And I celebrate that. And I absolutely love seeing this transformation and change and people being happier, more enjoying their work. It's fabulous. So yeah, every client. Um, where I'm going is greater impact. So I've been working one-to-one with clients, and that's still going to be the case because it's a very personal process. Your model of the world, your brain's map of the world, is personal to you. So when we change the belief that's sitting in that model, it has to be done in a very personal way. So it's always going to be a one-to-one process. I have got another coach working with me on this who I've trained, but my next step is to have greater impact, is to actually offer the training to corporations for them to offer on an anonymous basis to their executives. And the reason for that is that people have been coming to me on an individual basis. Most of them have been paying for themselves. A few have managed to get their companies to fund it. But one of the things in imposter syndrome is maybe, I don't quite deserve spending money on myself, even though it can have, massive impact. It can, earn them an extra million or two over the career, those kind of things. There's still that reluctance. And when a corporation is offering this, it's also saying you're worth it, right? We want you to succeed. We support you. And that's a very powerful message. And just that message itself helps counteract this idea that maybe they're going to fire me any moment,
Right.
which is part of imposter syndrome. So yeah, and so obviously then I have to scale. So this year I'm going to be training up some more coaches and training them on this method, so we'd be able to offer this at scale to large corporations who have very strong people development values.
Excellent. I mean, it's wonderful that you're able to scale the approach that is effective and shows results freeing people up from that little bit trap of that fraud feeling, so that they can then fulfill their potentials, both in their careers but also in life as well. Absolutely amazing. So kind of building on that then, obviously the focus on individual executives starting to reach out to corporations and grow that network of delivery. Who are you now looking as that next stage, evolution in your great work? Who are you looking to inspire?
So the inspiration, I think, is at that leadership level, and and I think just the whole message that imposter syndrome has a solution is inspirational. But there's the message that it's not you, which is so powerful and freeing just in itself, right? Changing that view that it's you to not you, that you're not alone, that 70% of executives experience this. So, and it has a solution. And that, I think, it's creating hope from a place that felt hopeless, and people felt trapped and felt like the only option they had was to suffer it or to leave. And then, no, this is the third option. You can get rid of it and then go on and fulfill your greatest potential, right? Even greater than you might have even thought for yourself.
Right, which is genuinely a fantastic aspiration to have. So let me try and sum up everything that you've said. And there's been so much insightful information in what you've said. And of course, every topic could dive in far deeper than we have time for now. But maybe I'll start with, so this feeling that worth is conditional and that we don't feel often good enough, and that thought process that we have internally, that somehow and at different times we feel a little bit like a fraud, that we're outperforming our own capabilities, which is really just a thought process in itself. And as a result, then that triggers us. Because we're triggered, we're not able to use our full high brain function all of the time, or sustainably throughout the day, or whatever it might be. And as a result of that, with that constant, almost like second track of conversation that's going on in our heads, through the coaching that you do, through the identification of that internal dialogue, you mentioned in your book about reframing, a process of then reframing that internal dialogue. That really then can free people up so that they can reach their full potential, which, as you said, the greatest success of those that have been able to kind of break free of that feeling of imposter syndrome and really then go on to even out achieve what they were potentially thought was possible, which is absolutely fantastic.
Yes. Well, let me give you a little example of that, because it sounds, it could be pretty much everything. So I was working with one CEO, and of course I can't mention the details, it's confidential. I was working with one CEO, and every time he saw that there was a board meeting in the diary, he sunk. He was, oh gosh. And then he went into the over preparing for it. He was stressed. He lost some sleep, worrying about it a couple of days before. When he get to the board meeting, he felt like he was just handing over his report, presenting his report, and that was it. It was very stressful. So when I started working with him, he actually had two board meetings, one in the middle of our work together and one at the end. And in the middle, he'd stopped having this dread ahead of the board meeting. He felt calm. He felt, in control. He felt like he could communicate, and he didn't have that stress and worry, and he could sleep better before and afterwards because he wasn't ruminating over it afterwards. Towards the end of the program, when we've got rid of imposter syndrome, then his tack is different. So then he starts spontaneously thinking strategically about, how can I use the board? What can we do? How can I use particular board members to bring more value to the company? How can I get them inspired and come along with my vision? So he went from, being very stressed and reporting to them to leading them. And and in a very natural way. It wasn't harder work. In fact, it was a lot easier and he was more comfortable and he was thrilled to be able to do that.
A fantastic story to really put, pragmatic results to everything that you've talked about. So then maybe a few final words of wisdom. How would you sum up, all of that great stuff in a couple of sentences?
Okay, so leadership is challenging, right? But it doesn't have to be so hard, right? That when you're free from imposter syndrome, it then becomes an adventure. It becomes the joy of developing mastery, the thrill of making a difference, and it's massively satisfying to stretch yourself and achieve what you are capable of.
Beautiful, beautiful. A nice ending to our wonderful conversation. Tara, thank you so much for spending the time with me, enlightening me on the topic of imposter syndrome. And I really hope that also helps other people understand everything that it's about and that there are solutions to that as well. So thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful day.
My pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. You too, Mark.